A rich teen mocked a quiet man on a first-class flight, then his father saw who that man really was and turned pale. Subscribe to our channel, tell us where you're watching from, and share if you enjoy stories like this. The airplane moved steadily through the night sky far above the world below, where cities had already turned into scattered clusters of light and then into darkness. Inside the first-class cabin, everything felt controlled, quiet, and distant from reality. The lighting was soft, carefully dimmed to create a sense of calm. The low hum of the engines blended with the occasional rustle of fabric or the faint clink of glass. It was the kind of silence that money could buy, comfortable, protected, and almost unreal. Passengers rested in wide reclining seats, some asleep beneath soft blankets, others quietly scrolling through screens or sipping drinks with slow, practiced ease. It was a space where people did not speak loudly, where behavior was measured, and where presence itself often carried an unspoken message about status. But not everyone followed those rules. Ryan Vass sat slouched in his seat, one leg stretched out, the other bouncing with restless energy. He was young, no more than 17, but already carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. His clothes were expensive but worn casually, as if their value didn't need to be proven. A watch gleamed on his wrist, far too costly for someone his age, and a pair of headphones hung loosely around his neck. He was bored, and boredom, for someone like Ryan, often turned into something else. His eyes drifted to the man seated beside him. At first glance, the man didn't seem to belong there. His clothes were simple, a dark jacket that had clearly been worn many times, a plain shirt underneath, and a black beanie pulled low over his head. His beard was slightly unkempt, not in a careless way, but in a way that suggested he simply didn't care how it looked. In his hands was an old book, not a tablet, not a phone, a book. Its edges were worn, the pages slightly yellowed, as if it had been opened many times before. The man sat quietly, leaning slightly forward, completely absorbed in reading. He didn't look around. He didn't check who was watching. He didn't seem aware or interested in the world around him. To Ryan, that was strange. To Ryan, that was wrong. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man with open curiosity that quickly shifted into amusement. Then, without hesitation, he let out a laugh loud enough to cut through the soft silence of the cabin. A few heads turned. Ryan didn't care. He leaned back in his seat and pointed casually at the man, as if he were pointing out something mildly entertaining, rather than deeply inappropriate. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet space. "Did you get lost?" The man didn't respond. Ryan smirked, leaning a little closer, his tone sharpening. "This isn't an economy." A few passengers shifted in their seats. One woman glanced up briefly, then looked away again, pretending not to notice. A man across the aisle adjusted his glasses and focused intently on his laptop screen, as if the words in front of him suddenly required all of his attention. No one spoke. The man with the book simply turned a page. Ryan blinked, slightly surprised. Most people reacted. Even if they tried to. "Eyes. Relax," he said dismissively. "It's just a joke." Lena held his gaze. "It's only a joke if everyone's laughing." Ryan opened his mouth ready to respond, but before he could, a flight attendant approached. She moved gracefully down the aisle, her presence calm and professional, but there was a subtle shift in her expression as she looked toward the man with the book. "Mr. Cole," she said gently, her tone respectful, almost warm, "is there anything you need?" For a moment everything seemed to pause. Ryan's expression froze. The name settled slowly in his mind like a delayed echo. Cole, Mr. Cole. Beside him Daniel Vass, his father, went completely still. Daniel had been working on his laptop, barely paying attention to his son's behavior, assuming it was harmless noise. But now he looked up sharply. And when he saw the man clearly for the first time, really saw him, his face drained of color. Ethan Cole. The name wasn't just familiar, it carried weight, influence, Power. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that announced itself in headlines or flashy displays. The quiet kind. The kind that moved things behind the scenes. The kind that decided outcomes without ever appearing to. Daniel's heart began to race. In an instant his mind filled with connections, business deals, partnerships, opportunities that depended on relationships like this. And his son had just mocked him. Publicly, carelessly. Daniel leaned forward quickly, his voice low but urgent. Ryan. Ryan didn't respond. He was still staring, confusion beginning to replace his earlier confidence. Ryan. Daniel repeated, sharper this time. Apologize. Ryan blinked. What? Now? There was something in his father's voice that Ryan had never heard before. Fear, not anger, not frustration, fear. And that unsettled him more than anything else. Slowly, awkwardly, Ryan shifted in his seat. He glanced at Ethan, then back at his father, then at Lena, as if trying to understand what had just changed. I'm sorry, he said finally. But the words felt empty. Even he seemed to know it. Ethan closed his book. The soft sound of its shutting felt louder than it should have. He turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on Ryan. Not harsh, not cold, but steady. For a moment no one spoke. Then Ethan said quietly, respect is not something you perform. Ryan swallowed. It's something you live. There was no anger in his voice, no judgment, just a simple truth spoken without effort. And somehow that made it heavier. Ryan looked down, unsure of what to say next. Daniel remained still, his hands gripping the edge of his seat, his mind racing with the possible consequences of what had just happened. But Ethan didn't continue. He didn't lecture. He didn't demand anything. He simply opened his book again and returned to reading as if the moment had already passed, as if it wasn't worth holding on to. The cabin slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but something had shifted. Lena sat back slightly, her eyes still on Ethan, not on what he had said, but on how he had said it. There was no need for him to prove who he was, no need to react, no need to assert control. He had simply remained himself, and somehow that had changed everything. Lena lowered her gaze for a moment, thoughtful, then she looked back at him again. And for the first time, her curiosity wasn't just professional. It was personal because people like him, people who had power but didn't use it to dominate, people who were seeing but chose not to be noticed, people who were challenged but didn't respond with ego, they were rare, very rare. And Lena Hassan had built her life around understanding people. But Ethan Cole, he didn't fit into any pattern she knew. And that, more than anything, made her want to understand him. For the rest of the flight, Lena Hassan tried to return to her work, but her attention no longer belonged to the document glowing on her tablet. The words in front of her blurred together, turning into nothing more than lines and shapes. Every few minutes, without meaning to, she found herself glancing across the aisle. Ethan Cole sat in the same position, calm and unreadable, his old book resting open in his hands as though nothing unusual had happened at all. It bothered her in a way she did not fully understand. She had spent years studying people, asking sharp questions, following hidden motives, and pulling truth from places where others preferred silence. Usually, it did not take long for her to place someone into a pattern. Arrogant men had one rhythm. Defensive people had another. The insecure performed loudly. The powerful either demanded to be recognized or worked carefully to protect their image. Ethan Cole had done none of those things. He had been insulted in public by a spoiled teenager, recognized by a panicked father, and exposed as someone important in the middle of a first-class cabin full of strangers, yet he had not shown even the smallest hunger to control the scene. That should have made him simple to understand. Instead, it made him impossible. Lena had built her career on refusing to let mystery remain mystery. Even as a child, she had disliked unfinished answers. She used to take apart broken radios in her father's small apartment just to see how the sound got inside. Later, when she became a journalist, that same impulse became discipline. She learned to search public records, study the language of official statements, compare timelines, and notice what was missing from polished stories. She had earned a reputation for being relentless but careful, direct without being careless. Some called her difficult. Some called her brave. Lena did not spend much time deciding which one was true. She had no room in her life for fragile opinions. She cared about facts, consequences, and the quiet obligation to use both responsibly. Yet now, sitting under the dim lights of a night flight, while the hum of the engines filled the cabin, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her professional instincts. Curiosity, yes, but there was also something more difficult to name. It was the feeling that she had witnessed a truth too brief to be fully understood. A glimpse of character that raised more questions than it answered. When the plane landed the next morning, the airport welcomed them with polished floors, tired faces, and the endless movement of people carrying expensive bags and private worries. Lena walked through immigration with the other passengers, her coat folded over one arm, and her phone already buzzing with messages from her editor. There had been a minor political resignation overnight, a labor protest expected by noon, and 2 messages asking whether she could cover a new corruption angle involving a transport contractor. Normally, that would have pulled her fully back into work. Instead, as she stood by the baggage carousel and watched suitcases circle beneath the hard fluorescent lights, she saw Ethan in the distance. He moved quietly through the terminal, accompanied by no visible security, no dramatic welcome, no crowd gathering around him. A driver waited near the exit, but even that looked understated. Ethan carried his own bag. He nodded once when the driver took it from him, then disappeared through a private glass door. Daniel Voss, by contrast, was scolding Ryan in low, furious tones near the customs line. His face still tense and pale with the humiliation he had not yet recovered from. Lena noticed the difference and stored it away instinctively. One man treated importance like a performance. The other seemed to carry it like a burden he had long ago stopped discussing. By the time she reached her apartment that afternoon, she was exhausted, but instead of sleeping, she made coffee, dropped her bag by the door, and opened her laptop. Her apartment was modest and practical, located on the 6th floor of an older building that looked plain from the outside, but caught beautiful afternoon light through its narrow windows. The furniture did not match perfectly. The kitchen was small. Books and papers occupied nearly every surface, and a half-dead plant leaned sadly near the balcony door because she kept forgetting to water it. None of that bothered her. Home for Lena was not about appearance. It was the one place where she did not need to explain her ambition, defend her hours, or show patience for anyone. She sat at her table, still wearing the same loose sweater from the flight, and searched for Ethan Cole's name. The first page of results told her almost nothing. A few standard profile pieces, mentions in entertainment trade reports, charitable foundations connected to development grants. Photos from events where he looked as though he had arrived accidentally and planned to leave as soon as possible. There were articles praising his investments, articles speculating about his taste, articles calling him elusive, generous, strategic, difficult to interview, and hard to define. But the details did not fit together cleanly. He influenced industries that rarely overlapped: film financing, renewable infrastructure, education initiatives, emergency logistics. He was connected to people who chased headlines, yet he himself was barely visible. Lena opened tab after tab. She read annual reports from nonprofit partners, donor acknowledgments, event coverage, legal filings, interviews with executives who mentioned him only in passing, and one profile from years earlier that seemed annoyed by how little it had managed to reveal. His wealth was obvious. His reach was obvious. But his public identity looked strangely unfinished, as if he had allowed the world to know only the outline of him. That was what unsettled her. Truly powerful people rarely stay hidden by accident. They disappeared by design. Sometimes that meant corruption, secrecy, and carefully protected damage. Other times, it meant fear. Lena had seen both. She knew how institutions buried harm beneath polite language. She also knew how private grief could make people withdraw until even praise felt like an invasion. But Ethan Cole did not read like a coward, and he did not yet read like a criminal. If anything, the small details surrounding him suggested discipline. Anonymous funding routed through partner structures. Projects announced without his personal name, even when his money clearly made them possible. Former employees describe him as demanding but fair. Beneficiaries who seemed unsure whether he wanted thanks at all. A hospital wing in a rural district. Scholarship programs. Supply transport after a flood. Quiet intervention in labor disputes. Lena leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. Who chooses to stay hidden when they don't have to? She asked the empty room. The question followed her into the next day, then the next. She told herself it was a professional interest. That much was true. Ethan Cole was a compelling profile because he represented a kind of influence that escaped public understanding. At a time when every wealthy figure seemed desperate to be seen as visionary, kind, disruptive, relevant, or morally exceptional, Ethan's refusal to narrate himself made him newsworthy in his own way. But Lena knew enough about herself to recognize when professional interest had become personal curiosity. She noticed it in the way she returned to his name after finishing unrelated assignments. She noticed it in how carefully she read every line connected to his foundations, searching not only for facts, but for tone. Most of all, she noticed it in the feeling left behind by that moment on the plane. Respect is not something you perform. It's something you live. The sentence had been simple, but it had not been prepared for an audience. Men like Daniel Vass always had lines ready for the room. Ethan had sounded like a man who rarely needed one. 3 days later, Lena pitched a profile to her editor. Not a celebrity piece, not a flattering feature, a serious long-form article about quiet influence, private philanthropy, and the ethics of power without publicity. Her editor, Farid, listened while standing by the glass wall of the newsroom with a paper cup in one hand and permanent skepticism in his eyes. He was a good editor because he trusted talent, but not obsession. Why him? He asked when she finished. Because he matters and no one understands why. Lena said. Farid studied her for a moment. Or because you saw him on a plane and now you're interested. Lena did not react. Farid smiled faintly. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying know the difference. Then he looked back at his notes. If you can get him to talk, you have the profile. If he refuses, I'm not giving you 3 weeks to chase a man who likes hiding. Lena nodded once. That was fair. In her world, curiosity only mattered if it could survive reality. She made the first request formally through Ethan Cole's public media office, which appeared to be run by people skilled in saying no with polished kindness. Her email was precise, respectful, and impossible to misunderstand. She explained the angle. She demonstrated seriousness. The answer came the next afternoon. Mr. Cole appreciates your interest, but is unable to participate at this time. Lena stared at the sentence for a moment, then closed the message without emotion. Refusal was normal. Refusal did not mean impossible. It simply meant the first door was closed. She tried again through another route. There was a foundation liaison whose name appeared on several education initiatives. There was a producer in one of Ethan's film projects who had once spoken at a panel Lena covered. There was a legal representative connected to a community health grant. Lena did not push carelessly. She disliked aggressive reputation hunting, and she despised the kind of journalism that tried to corner people for sport. What she did instead was build a case. She spoke to people adjacent to Ethan's work, not asking for gossip, but for understanding. A school director in a coastal town said Ethan funded roof repairs after a storm and never came for the opening ceremony. A doctor who had worked with one of his relief initiatives said he asked hard questions about logistics, but never attached conditions about publicity. An arts administrator said he once declined to put his name on a theater restoration because, in his words, the building matters more than the donor. That phrase stayed with her. She wrote it in her notebook and circled it twice. The more she learned, the more her original suspicion softened into a more complex kind of caution. She did not believe in saints. Public life had cured her of that early. Every admired figure had shadows, every institution concealed compromises, and every generous act existed inside systems shaped by power. But there was a difference between complexity and performance. Ethan's footprint suggested complexity. That made him more interesting, not less. So she changed her approach. Her second interview request was shorter and more direct. She did not present him as an enigma. She did not flatter his reputation. Instead, she wrote that she was interested in one question: what responsibility belongs to people with influence when public visibility can help some causes and harm others? It was not a request for his life story. It was a request for an argument. Lena had learned long ago that some guarded people responded better to challenge than admiration. 4 days passed with no answer. She assumed another refusal would come. On the 5th day, her phone rang from an unfamiliar number while she was leaving court after a hearing related to a procurement investigation. Traffic screamed outside the building. Someone nearby was giving a statement to camera crew. Lena pressed a hand to her other ear and answered. A woman introduced herself as Mara, part of Mr. Cole's office. Her voice was warm but efficient. Mr. Cole can offer 45 minutes next Tuesday at 11 o'clock off the record regarding personal matters. On the record regarding philanthropy, ethics, and public responsibility. No photography during the meeting. Location to follow. Lena stopped walking. For half a second, surprise broke through her usual control. "I'll be there," she said. Mara thanked her and ended the call. That night, Lena slept badly, not because she was nervous in the childish sense, but because her mind refused to settle. She kept turning over possible directions the conversation might take. If he were careful, he would try to stay abstract. If he were truly private, he would shut down any suggestion that personal history shaped public choices. If he were smarter than most powerful men, he would understand how much could be revealed without directly answering anything. Lena did not resent that. Interviews were never simple extractions of truth. They were negotiations of language, power, timing, and trust. The best conversations happened when both people respected the stakes. Still, she knew she had to be prepared. She reread her notes, studied his projects again, and built a structure in her mind. Start with public action, move toward values, test contradictions, press gently where the tension reveals something deeper. By midnight, she closed her laptop and stood by the window looking out at the city. A train line flashed in the distance. Somewhere below, a couple argued and then laughed. Lena folded her arms and exhaled slowly. She was not afraid of Ethan Cole. But she understood, perhaps better than she wanted to admit, that some meetings mattered before they even began. Tuesday arrived cold and bright. The address Mara sent led Lena to a restored historic building in an older part of the city, where the street outside smelled faintly of coffee and rain-wet stone. The building looked understated from the outside, with clean windows and no flashy signage, but inside it had been renovated with care. Wood, glass, muted colors, fresh flowers on a side table that no one seemed eager to notice. She gave her name at reception and was shown upstairs to a quiet room with long windows overlooking a narrow square. The room felt more like a private library than an office. Books lined one wall. A simple table stood near the center. There were no awards on display, no carefully framed magazine covers, no symbols arranged to communicate status. That absence itself felt deliberate. Lena arrived early. She sat with her notebook closed on the table and forced herself not to rehearse too much. A few minutes later, the door opened and Ethan walked in alone. He looked different in daylight than he had on the plane, though not by much. He wore dark trousers, a charcoal sweater, and a plain coat, which he removed as he entered. There was still something deliberately unadorned about him, as if comfort and function had long ago replaced any interest in presentation. His beard was trimmed more neatly than she remembered. The same calm sat around him, though it did not feel detached. It felt practiced, like stillness chosen over display. "Ms. Hassan," he said, offering his hand. "Lena is fine," she replied, standing to meet him. He nodded. Then Ethan. His handshake was brief and firm. Nothing in it tried to dominate. Nothing tried to charm. They sat across from each other. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of traffic below. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Lena said. "You changed the question," Ethan replied. She tilted her head. Slightly. "From what?" "From who are you to what do you believe?" His gaze was steady but not severe. That made it harder to refuse. Lena allowed herself the smallest smile. "Good." To her surprise, the corner of his mouth moved, too. Not quite a smile but close enough to suggest he appreciated honesty when it arrived without decoration. She opened her notebook. "Then let me start there. You influence industries that shape public life, film, education, relief funding, infrastructure, yet you avoid visibility whenever possible. Why?" Ethan leaned back slightly, one arm resting on the chair. "Visibility is useful when it serves the work. It becomes dangerous when it starts replacing the work." "That sounds good," Lena said. "It also sounds like a sentence someone polished for years." His expression did not change but his eyes sharpened. "You asked why." I answered. "You answered generally." General answers are often more honest than personal ones. Lena wrote that down. "I disagree." "I assumed you would." Something in his tone carried the faintest trace of dry humor, and for a second the room felt less formal. Lena noticed it and disliked how quickly she noticed it. She kept her focus where it belonged. "People deserve to understand the values behind power," she said, "especially when that power affects public lives. If influence stays hidden, accountability becomes difficult." Ethan folded his hands loosely. "And if visibility turns every effort into theater, accountability becomes performance. People stop asking whether a thing helped and start asking who gets credit." "That can be true," Lena admitted, "but secrecy also protects people who want admiration without scrutiny." "Yes," he nodded once. "It can." The directness of the answer caught her off guard. She had expected deflection, perhaps a softened version of agreement. Instead, he gave her the point cleanly, then waited. "So which are you protecting?" she asked. "The work or yourself?" The question hung between them. Lena watched him carefully. She was testing him now, not simply interviewing. Most powerful men resented that. Some admired it publicly while punishing it privately later. Ethan did neither. He looked toward the window for a moment before returning his gaze to her. "Sometimes," he said, "I'm not claiming purity. Public attention distorts people. It changes incentives. It invites simplification. It also feeds vanity. I would rather spend energy on structures than image." "That sounds noble." "It sounds practical." "And yet," Lena said, "you still operate in film, an industry built on image." A quieter person might have taken that as an accusation. Ethan looked almost thoughtful. "That's why it interests me. People think stories are decoration. They aren't. Stories are infrastructure, too. They shape what society notices, excuses, admires, and ignores." Lena paused with her pen above the page. That was not the answer she expected, and she hated that part of her admired it immediately. "Then why stay outside the frame?" Because not every person funding a story needs to stand in front of it. You really don't enjoy being seen, do you? His eyes settled on her for a second longer this time. You say that as if visibility is a natural reward. For many people, it is. For many people, it becomes a habit, he said. And habits are difficult to question once the world starts rewarding them. Lena crossed one leg over the other and studied him. You're careful. You're direct. Occupational hazard. Mine, too. The conversation continued like that. Each sentence measured but alive. Each answer opening rather than closing the tension between them. Lena moved through topics with growing confidence. She asked about donor anonymity, about influence without election, and about whether private wealth solving public problems weaken pressure on governments to do their jobs. Ethan answered thoughtfully, sometimes slowly, never hurrying to protect himself with too many words. He admitted contradictions where they existed. He did not pretend philanthropy was clean. He spoke about the danger of treating charity as moral permission. He acknowledged that private intervention could never substitute for justice. At best, he said at one point, it can buy time. It can reduce harm. Sometimes that matters. Sometimes it becomes an excuse for people with more power than I have to do less. Lena wrote that down, too. But the real friction between them emerged when she shifted from systems to truth. You said in your message that you wanted to discuss responsibility, Ethan said after she pressed him on public disclosure in philanthropic structures. So, let me ask you something. In your work, when you expose something true, is the truth itself enough? Lena frowned slightly. Enough for what? To justify harm? She held his gaze. Truth doesn't create harm. People do. That's a clean answer, he said quietly. The world rarely behaves that cleanly. Her spine straightened. If wrongdoing is hidden, exposing it is necessary. I agree. Then what are we arguing about? Timing, method, context, collateral damage. Ethan's tone remained calm, but there was more. Wade in it now. You report something true. A facility shuts down before workers are protected. A source is exposed indirectly. A family becomes a target because details were technically relevant. The story is accurate. The consequences remain. Lena felt heat rise in her chest, not because he was entirely wrong, but because he was stepping onto ground she knew intimately. Are you asking whether journalism should protect people from the truth? I'm asking whether truth is always helped by exposure. The room seemed to tighten around the question. For a brief moment, Lena said nothing. She thought of stories she had published that led to reform and stories that led to backlash before reform. She thought of a whistleblower who had to leave his city after a procurement piece, even though she had guarded his identity carefully. She thought of a labor report she once delayed for 2 weeks because workers asked for time to move their savings. She thought of long nights arguing with editors about names, details, sequence, and risk. Ethan's question touched a nerve because it assumed complexity she lived with but rarely discussed in public. Still, she did not retreat. The answer can't be silence, she said. I didn't say silence. It sounds close. It sounds like judgment under pressure, Ethan replied, which is what you already practice whether you admit it or not. That annoyed her precisely because it contained too much truth. Don't tell me how I do my job. Then don't pretend your job is free of moral choices. For the first time since the meeting began, actual sharpness entered the room, not anger exactly, but force. Lena set her pen down. My job is to bring facts into the light. People with power survive because everyone around them keeps asking for patience, discretion, context, and timing. Meanwhile, harm continues. And my point, Ethan said, is that there are moments when discretion protects the people being harmed, not the people causing harm. Convenient. Yes, he said, that's why it's dangerous. She stared at him. He stared back. Neither looked away. What unsettled Lena most was not that he argued well. Many people argued well. It was that he seemed to understand the weak places inside her certainty without trying to exploit them cheaply. He was not performing humility or scoring points. He was speaking as someone who had spent real time thinking about consequences. That made disagreement with him harder and therefore more interesting. After a moment, Lena leaned back and exhaled slowly. You realize this is not making you easier to profile. I wasn't aware that was the goal. It's always the goal, she said before she could stop herself. That time he did smile, though only briefly. It transformed his face more than she expected, softening some hidden severity in it. That sounds exhausting. It is. Then why do it? The question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Lena had been asked versions of it before, usually by people who wanted to sound concerned while suggesting she become less difficult. But Ethan's voice carried neither condescension nor pity. He sounded genuinely curious. She looked down at her notebook, then back at him. Because people count on silence, she said. Because lies spread faster when everyone is too tired to challenge them. Because if no one asks the next question, power writes its own story and calls it truth. Ethan listened without interrupting. Lena surprised herself by continuing. I grew up watching respectable men explain away damage as necessity. They always had language for it. Always context. Always reason that the public didn't understand. I learned early that if you let people define reality unchecked, they start believing they own it. The room was quiet after she finished. She had not intended to reveal even that much. Personal disclosure during an interview usually irritated her unless it served a purpose. Yet Ethan did not treat it like advantage. He simply absorbed it as though he understood the cost of speaking from somewhere real. And I learned, he said after a moment, that visibility attracts people who mistake access for care. Lena's eyes narrowed slightly. That sounds personal. It is. She waited, thinking he might elaborate. He did not. Then maybe general answers aren't always the most honest, she said. Something flickered in his expression. No offense. Recognition perhaps, maybe not. The tension in the room changed after that. It did not disappear, but it acquired depth. The conversation no longer felt like a professional duel between a guarded man and a persistent journalist. It felt like two people standing at the edge of different convictions, each beginning to suspect the other had earned them honestly. They spoke for longer than the scheduled 45 minutes. Mara knocked once near the hour mark, but Ethan glanced at the door and said, 10 more minutes. Without taking his eyes from Lena. Those 10 minutes turned into 20. They discussed public trust, reputation laundering, the ethics of anonymous giving, and whether modern culture had become too dependent on visible goodness rather than measurable responsibility. Lena pushed him on his choice to stay privately influential. Ethan pushed her on the hidden moral editing that all serious journalism required. At one point, she asked whether he trusted the media at all. I trust individual judgment more than institutions, he said. That applies to your profession as much as mine. She almost laughed at the word mine because even then she could not fully define what his profession actually was. Investor, producer, benefactor, strategist, patron, reluctant public figure. He existed across categories while committing fully to none of them. Eventually, Lena closed her notebook. I think that's enough for one meeting. One meeting? Ethan repeated. She met his gaze evenly. You ask difficult questions. That usually means there's more beneath them, and you intend to find it. I'm a journalist. I noticed. Again, that small dry humor. Again, she noticed too quickly. He stood, and so did she. For a second tea, they remained on opposite sides of the table, the conversation still somehow present between them like a third thing neither was ready to dismiss. Lena realized with a sudden clarity that irritated her that she did not fully want the meeting to end. Not because she had gotten what she needed, because she had not. "Will you read the piece before publication?" she asked, knowing even as she said it that the question mattered more than editorial courtesy. "No," Ethan replied, "but if you need factual corrections from my office, ask." That's a risky level of trust. "No," he said, holding her gaze, "it's a risky level of curiosity." She almost smiled at that, but restrained herself. "I haven't decided which one this is." "Neither have I." Mara escorted her out, though the walk downstairs felt oddly unreal, as if some part of Lena remained in that room by the window, still circling the argument they had begun. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray. Cars moved slowly through the square. A man on a bicycle swerved around a delivery truck. Life resumed its ordinary motion, but Lena stood still for a few seconds on the pavement, her notebook pressed against her coat. She had expected one of two outcomes. Either Ethan Cole would turn out to be another polished, powerful man skilled in saying little while appearing thoughtful, or he would be a more unusual version of private wealth, careful, strategic, and emotionally unavailable in predictable ways. Instead, she had encountered someone who resisted classification. He had not charmed her. He had not tried to. He had not yielded, but he had not hidden behind emptiness, either. He had challenged her with a seriousness that felt earned, and in doing so, he had unsettled something she normally kept well-ordered. Her opinions remained her own. She still believed in scrutiny, disclosure, and the danger of private influence, but now those beliefs had been forced into sharper contact with another set of convictions that refused easy dismissal. That night, back at her apartment, Lena reread her notes 3 times. She could hear his voice in the shape of the sentences. Visibility is useful when it serves the work. Public attention distorts people. Truth is not always helped by exposure. She wrote drafts of an opening paragraph and deleted them all. Every version felt too simple, too confident, too eager to make him either admirable or evasive. He was both less and more than either category allowed. She hated stories that flattened people into symbols, even when those people had enough power to deserve aggressive scrutiny, especially then. Simplification was its own kind of dishonesty. Sometime after midnight, she made tea and stood by the kitchen counter in the half-dark. Rain touched the windows in soft, uneven taps. The city below had quieted. She thought about the moment on the plane when he had refused to use humiliation as currency. She thought about his question, "Is the truth itself enough?" She thought about how quickly he had understood that her second message was not really about philanthropy at all, but about belief. A man like that noticed patterns. A man like that did not agree to conversations lightly. Lena lifted the cup to her mouth and let the heat settle her. She knew one thing with unusual certainty: whatever this story became, it was no longer a simple profile. It had become something far more difficult and far more compelling, a collision between two ways of seeing the world, both intelligent, both incomplete, both sharper in contact with the other. She did not yet trust him. She did not intend to, but somewhere beneath the tension and the intellectual resistance, another current had begun to move, faint, restrained, undeniable. It was not warmth, not yet, not anything so easy. It was respect, and with it came the strange, disquieting sense that their conversation was not finished, not even close. In the weeks that followed their first interview, Lena told herself more than once that her continued attention to Ethan Cole was still professional, still disciplined, still rooted in the same sharp instinct that had guided her through every serious story of her career. She repeated that thought while reviewing notes late at night, while crossing crowded streets with her coat wrapped tightly against the wind, while standing in the back of meeting rooms where officials made careful speeches and reporters searched for the weak points in polished statements. But repetition did not make the thought fully true. Something had shifted after that conversation in the quiet room with the tall windows. Ethan had not charmed her, had not tried to win her over, and had certainly not offered the kind of easy quotable vulnerability that often made powerful people feel more human without costing them anything real. What he had done instead was more dangerous to her certainty. He had forced her to take his convictions seriously. He had made arguments she could not dismiss as vanity or manipulation. Even when she disagreed with him, she found herself turning his words over in her mind, testing them, resisting them, then returning to them again with reluctant curiosity. That alone would have been enough to hold her attention, but then she began to see his work up close, and close observation changed something far more difficult than opinion. It changed instinct. The first time Lena saw Ethan outside the controlled frame of an interview was in a neighborhood on the southern edge of the city where a small community clinic had nearly closed 3 times in 4 years. The building itself looked tired from the outside, its paint faded by heat and weather, its metal gate repaired so many times that the weld lines showed like scars. The clinic sat between a grocery shop and a row of apartments with laundry hanging from narrow balconies above the street, and anyone driving past too quickly would have assumed it was just another overburdened service in a neglected district. Lena had come there because one of her sources had mentioned, almost casually, that a supply issue had been resolved within days after months of government delay, and that the money had come through a private channel no one could fully explain. She expected to find an administrator eager to flatter a donor. She expected a plaque, a public relations team, or at the very least someone prepared to say Ethan Cole's name with grateful importance. Instead, she found a nurse in wrinkled blue scrubs arguing with a delivery man over missing cartons of antibiotics, and a waiting room full of mothers trying to keep restless children calm. No one seemed aware that a story might be hiding in the ordinary strain of the place. Lena introduced herself, asked careful questions, and was eventually led toward the back of the clinic where voices drifted from a cramped storage room. Ethan was standing beside a metal shelving unit with a clipboard in one hand and his sleeves rolled to his forearms. A local doctor, exhausted but alert, was speaking quickly about refrigeration failures, procurement delays, and the difficulty of retaining staff when salaries arrived late. Ethan listened the way he had answered questions in the interview, without interruption, without the impatience of a man waiting to speak. He asked about backup generators, transport routes, repair costs, staffing patterns, not in the vague language of a donor who wanted to sound informed, but in the precise language of someone trying to understand what would actually keep the clinic functioning after the meeting ended. When the doctor mentioned that mothers were missing work because vaccine days kept changing without notice, Ethan asked who handled neighborhood communication and whether a local school could help distribute consistent schedules. When the nurse appeared at the door and said one of the fridges had gone warm again, he put the clipboard down and followed her without any sign that such interruptions were beneath him. Lena remained partly hidden by the doorway, notebook in hand, and watched with a focus that was at once professional and unexpectedly personal. He did not look like a savior. He did not look like a businessman performing a concern. He looked like a man who had learned, perhaps by necessity, that help without attention to detail was often just another form of self-congratulation. He noticed her only after the immediate rush of the problem had passed. The nurse stepped away, the doctor turned to answer a call, and Ethan looked up from the fridge maintenance log he was studying. There was a flicker of surprise in his face, followed almost instantly by recognition. "You move quietly for a journalist," he said. Lena lifted one shoulder in a half shrug. "You move quietly for a man people keep calling powerful." The corner of his mouth shifted in that brief, almost smile she had begun, against her better judgment, to recognize. "That sounds like an accusation." "Observation," she replied. "Those are often related." He set the log back on the counter and glanced toward the waiting room. "If you're here for a statement, I don't have one. I'm here because I was told something in this neighborhood changed fast when everything else had been moving slowly." "And?" he asked. Lena looked around the cramped room, then back at him. "And I wanted to see whether the story looked the same up close." For a second, indeed, he said nothing, as if deciding how much of her answer to believe. Then he gestured toward the open corridor. "It usually doesn't." That became the pattern of the weeks that followed. Lena did not follow Ethan in a reckless or secretive way. She followed trails attached to work that mattered: education grants, labor mediation, transport logistics for flood relief in a neighboring district, a scholarship meeting in a public school where 3 ceiling fans worked and 2 did not. Sometimes she arrived because
someone mentioned his involvement. Sometimes she found documentation that connected one of his quiet foundations to a project no article had covered. Sometimes he was there and sometimes he was not. But when he was present, the same thing happened each time. He listened first. It was such a simple quality that at first Lena distrusted it. Men who held real power often learned to imitate listening because it made others cooperate more easily. Yet imitation always betrayed itself under pressure. Impatience entered the shoulders. Vanity entered the solutions. At the first sign of disorder, performance cracked. Ethan never seemed eager to own the room. He wanted information, leverage, workable plans, and above all, continuity. He had the peculiar habit of asking who would still be handling a problem 3 months later, as though he found short-term success deeply uninteresting if it could not survive ordinary neglect. When a school principal thanked him publicly in front of a district committee, he redirected the conversation to teacher retention within seconds. When a local organizer tried to place him at the center of a group photo, he stepped aside so the staff stood in front. More than once, Lena saw frustration flicker across the faces of people who clearly wished he would accept the role of visible benefactor because visible benefactors were easier to market, easier to admire, easier to use. Ethan never seemed hostile to gratitude. He simply refused to turn it
into a structure. The more Lena observed him, the more she became aware of something in herself softening without permission. She still distrusted concentrated power. She still believed private wealth distorted public priorities and allowed governments to hide behind the generosity of individuals. She had not become naive and she would have despised herself if she had. But reality, when examined closely enough, had a way of resisting the clean lines of ideology. Ethan was not replacing institutions, at least not in the way she had feared. He was often pressuring them, stitching gaps long enough to keep vulnerable people from falling through, funding practical transitions where bureaucracy had stalled. It did not solve the larger injustice. He never claimed it did. Yet he also did not use that imperfection as an excuse to do nothing. That distinction lodged beneath her skin. She noticed it when she wrote notes. She noticed it when she argued with herself in the shower. She noticed it most of all when she watched him leave difficult meetings without lingering for praise, as if public acknowledgement had become not merely unnecessary to him, but vaguely embarrassing. Ethan, for his part, seemed to notice Lena in ways that unsettled her for entirely different reasons. He noticed what she asked local staff when she thought no one important was listening. He noticed that she never pushed frightened sources to say more than they wanted to say. He noticed that when public officials made vague claims about improvement, she did not react with theatrical skepticism, but with specific questions that forced clarity. Once after a funding review at a school library with more
empty shelves than books, they ended up standing outside beneath a dull evening sky while children played football badly in the yard behind them. Ethan watched as Lena spoke quietly with a janitor who had first raised concerns about unsafe wiring. She never opened her notebook in front of him. She let him speak at his pace, asked only 2 questions, thanked him without promising miracles, and walked back toward Ethan with the expression she wore whenever she was thinking hard enough to forget the world around her. "You make people less afraid," Ethan said. Lena looked at him surprised. That's not a common complaint about journalists. It wasn't a complaint. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and glanced toward the school building. Most people in your position would have pushed harder. I was already nervous. Yes, Ethan said, and there was something almost approving in the quietness of it. You noticed. Lena should have answered lightly, perhaps with some hard joke to restore distance, but she found herself saying the truth instead. If you ask for truth from frightened people, you owe them enough patience to survive giving it. Ethan looked at her then with an intensity that was not romantic, not yet, but deeply attentive. That's a costly principle. Most useful ones are, she replied. Their conversations began to happen in the spaces between official reasons. A coffee after a site visit because rain had started and neither of them wished to stand in it. 10 minutes beside a loading dock while a delayed truck was being unloaded. A long drive back from a river district where road repairs had stalled and children still crossed a damaged bridge to reach school. In those conversations, the tension between them remained, but it changed texture. It was no longer the hard edge of strangers testing one another for weakness. It became something quieter and more persistent, the friction of two minds unwilling to lie and increasingly unable to dismiss. Ethan would ask questions that slipped beneath her professional armor with irritating accuracy. Why did she carry every failure in the systems she covered as if it were her private debt? Why did she sound angriest when people disappointed her rather than when they behaved exactly as corruption predicted? Lena, in turn, pressed him where she sensed absence. Why did he care so much about repairing structures while remaining personally unreachable? Why did he make room for everyone else's pain, but speak about his own life as if it belonged to a locked house he had no intention of entering? Neither of them answered fully. Yet each answer, incomplete as it was, made the next conversation easier and more dangerous. One evening, they met at a small restaurant near the old train station after an unexpectedly difficult day involving a transport contract dispute. The place was modest, warm, and crowded with office workers eating late dinners under yellow lights. Lena had chosen it without thinking because the food was honest and the owner minded his own business. Ethan arrived a few minutes after her carrying rain on the shoulders of his coat. He looked tired and something about that visible fatigue, so ordinary, so human sharpened her awareness of him. They ordered tea before food and for several minutes neither spoke. Outside, buses hissed at the curb and disappeared into the dark. Inside, plates clinked, someone laughed too loudly at the back, and a television mounted near the kitchen played muted news headlines no one seemed to trust. It was Lena who broke the silence. "You help everyone," she said, turning the glass between her fingers, "but you keep yourself distant." Ethan did not answer at once. He watched the steam rise from his tea as if the shape of it might offer precision. "That sounds simple when you say it," he replied at last. "Isn't it?" Lena asked. He looked up and there was no annoyance in his face, only the weary alertness of a man deciding whether to spend honesty where it might matter. "Distance is not always refusal," he said. "Sometimes it's maintenance." Lena frowned slightly. "Of what?" "Function, perspective, endurance." He leaned back in the narrow chair. "People romanticize closeness. They assume care must always be intimate to be real. Sometimes distance is what allows a person to keep helping without confusing need, guilt, gratitude, obligation, and grief until none of it can be carried properly." Lena held his gaze, hearing in the answer what he did not say. "That sounds lonely." "It often is." The words were quiet, almost accidental. She did not move. He seemed to realize he had given more than intended because his expression changed a fraction, the door not closing exactly but no longer standing open. She could have let the moment pass but something in her resisted the easy retreat. "And you think closeness always becomes a burden?" she asked. Ethan looked at her for a long second then gave a small shake of his head. "No. I think losing it does." The simplicity of that answer struck her harder than a longer confession would have. She did not know the details of his past but she no longer needed them to recognize the outline of pain around which he had built discipline. For a while they were silent again and when Ethan finally lifted his eyes toward her, his expression had changed just enough to show that he was no longer speaking in abstractions. "And you," he said, "fight everything. Do you ever allow yourself peace?" Lena let out a short breath that might have become a laugh in another mood. "That sounds like criticism." "Observation," he said, borrowing her word from weeks earlier. "Those are often related." She should not have smiled, but she did. Then the smile faded because the question deserved more than wit. "Peace is a luxury where I come from," she said. "That's a clever sentence," Ethan replied. "It's also not fully true." She looked away toward the rain-blurred window. Maybe not. She thought of childhood evenings in a small apartment where her mother rationed worry into silence because money was short and dignity mattered. She thought of the first time she understood that respectable institutions could leave ordinary people invisible for years without ever raising their voices. She thought of how anger had become fuel, then habit, then identity. "If I stop pushing," she said finally, "I'm afraid I'll start accepting things that should never feel normal." Ethan did not interrupt. "And if you never stop?" he asked. Lena had no answer that satisfied her. The waiter arrived with food and the conversation moved elsewhere, but the question stayed with her long after the plates were cleared. It was not until nearly 3 weeks later that everything changed. The story reached Lena the way serious stories often did, not as a single revelation, but as a pattern of unease too specific to ignore. A labor contact from the industrial district sent a cautious message asking whether she had ever looked into working conditions at Kestrel Components, a mid-size manufacturing company that supplied parts to larger infrastructure firms. The message itself was vague, but attached to it were 2 photographs of time sheets and a short note saying workers had been threatened with dismissal after raising safety concerns. Lena began where she always began, with documents. She requested public records, reviewed procurement histories, checked import and export volumes, wage filings, safety audits, and ownership structures. Kestrel Components looked respectable enough from the outside. Stable growth, technically compliant reports, charitable sponsorship of local sports programs, routine language about workforce development. The normal false shine of a company that understood optics. But beneath those polished surfaces, irregularities began to appear. Overtime records did not match wage distributions. Injury reporting had dropped suspiciously low during periods when production increased. Temporary housing deductions taken from worker salaries looked inflated. A supplier route connected to one of the plants had changed after an internal complaint about machine maintenance. Yet, the complaint itself had vanished from the official trail. Lena traveled to the district twice in 3 days. The industrial park sat beyond the newer suburbs, a landscape of wide roads, security barriers, warehouses, and low buildings with heat trapped in the concrete. She spoke with workers off-site, careful to protect identities, careful not to gather people in ways that drew attention. At first, the stories came cautiously. Each person giving only enough to test whether she could be trusted. Then more emerged. 12-hour shifts are recorded as 8. Faulty ventilation in 1 unit. Safety gloves are reused long after they should have been replaced. Threats that contracts would not be renewed if complaints continued. Housing is linked to employment, making dismissal risk more than lost wages. One man showed her a burned scar on his wrist and said the incident had never been formally logged. A woman who handled payroll documents described pressure from management to recode categories before inspection periods. Lena's stomach tightened with the familiar unwelcome mixture of outrage and focus. This was the kind of story that justified every hard thing about her job. It was concrete, documentable, urgent. It affected people who had little room to absorb more harm. She worked late nights assembling timelines, cross-checking claims, and building the structure of an investigation that could withstand legal pressure. By the end of the week, she was certain of one thing. The company was exploiting workers while protecting itself with bureaucratic polish. Then she found Ethan's name. Not directly. Ethan never attached himself directly where risk could be cheaply dramatized. But one of the firms financing a logistics expansion for Kestrel Components was linked through layered holdings to a private investment vehicle associated with Ethan's broader portfolio. Lena stared at the corporate chart on her screen, tracing the lines twice, then a third time, willing them to rearrange into coincidence. They did not. The connection was real, not simple, not public-facing, but real enough to matter. Her first reaction was anger, not because the evidence condemned him fully, but because the ambiguity cut straight through the fragile trust she had begun, reluctantly, to allow. Had he known? Was this the kind of quiet complexity he defended when he spoke about timing and collateral damage? Was she about to discover that his thoughtful ethics were merely a more elegant version of the same compromise powerful men always made? She barely slept that night. Every argument he had made about discretion now sounded vulnerable to suspicion. Every quiet act of help threatened to become part of a larger story about reputational insulation. By morning, her notes were spread across her table, her coffee had gone cold, and the knot in her chest had tightened into resolve. She would confront him before publishing, not as a courtesy, but as a test. Ethan agreed to see her that same evening. The meeting took place in a bare conference room at one of his foundation offices, long after most of the staff had gone home. The city outside the windows had already dissolved into lights and dark glass. Lena arrived with a folder full of documents and the rigid calm she wore when emotion needed to be kept on a short leash. Ethan came in a minute later, saw her face, and seemed to understand immediately that this was not an ordinary conversation. He closed the door himself and remained standing for a moment. "What happened?" he asked. Lena laid the papers on the table between them. "Kestrel components," she said, "exploiting workers, wage manipulation, safety failures. Threats tied to contract renewal and housing deductions. I have documents, testimonies, audit inconsistencies, and a financial chain that leads indirectly but clearly to your investment network." She watched his face while she spoke, searching for defensiveness, surprise, calculation. Ethan looked down at the top sheet, then at the others beneath it. He did not immediately touch them. He did not ask how much she knew. He did not perform outrage for her benefit. That absence infuriated her more than denial would have. "Did you know?" she asked. He was silent for one beat too long, then he said, "Part of it." The answer struck like cold water. "Part of it?" Lena repeated. "That's what you're going with?" Her voice sharpened despite her effort to control it. "People are being worked into injury, wages are being manipulated, management is threatening dismissal, and you knew part of it." Ethan finally sat down, not slowly, but with the measured movement of a man refusing escalation. "I knew there were labor concerns severe enough to trigger an internal intervention," he said. "I did not know the full extent of what you're describing until 3 days ago." Lena stared at him. "And what exactly is an internal intervention?" "A pressure process through financing leverage, legal review, and contingency restructuring." "You mean a quiet fix?" "I mean a controlled one." Laughed once without humor. "Of course you do." Ethan took the hit without flinching. "Lena, no." She leaned forward, palms flat against the table. "Don't do that. Don't make this sound nuanced when it's simple. Workers are being harmed. This story goes public." "If it goes public now," he said, and there was sudden force in his voice, not loud but unmistakable, "the plant may shut before protections are in place. The parent contracts will freeze. Management will cut temporary staff first. Housing linked to employment will be used as leverage. The people you're trying to protect will absorb the first wave of damage before any reform arrives." The room went still. Lena held his gaze, furious because the possibility was real enough to wound certainty. "That sounds like exactly the argument every powerful person makes when exposure threatens them." "Yes," Ethan said quietly, "which is why I know how it sounds." He slid one of the documents toward himself and read a section quickly, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I've been trying to isolate the abusive management layer, secure emergency wage protection, and move housing control away from employer-linked contracts. There are negotiations underway with 2 outside operators willing to absorb the facility if the current board is forced out. But none of that survives a public shock tonight. Lena did not sit. And I'm supposed to take your word for that? No, he said. You're supposed to decide whether the workers can survive the truth and inform you're prepared to publish it. The sentence landed harder than any self-defense. Lena hated him a little for being able to frame the question that way. She hated herself more for recognizing that it was the right question. For several seconds, neither spoke. The city hummed beyond the glass. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut. Lena's mind raced through everything she had gathered, everything she believed, everything he might still be hiding. "Show me," she said at last. Ethan looked up. "What?" "Show me what you're doing." Not a speech, not principles, evidence. Something in his expression shifted, not relief exactly, but the recognition of terms he could respect. He opened a secure folder on the laptop already on the table and turned it toward her. There were legal memos, financial pressure points, draft agreements, emergency wage escrow proposals, correspondence with labor counsel, housing transition models, and timelines attached to regulatory exposure risk. Lena moved through the documents with intense concentration, asking questions fast and precisely. Why had the first warning not triggered an immediate outside inspection? Which board members were protected by delayed reporting? How many workers were tied to housing? How soon could wage guarantees be separated from current management? Ethan answered every question he could, admitted where timelines were uncertain, and did not once ask her to stop digging. The more she read, the more unbearable the situation became. Not because he was innocent, but because the reality was complicated. Enough to punish clean action. He had been working to dismantle the problem quietly. He'd also, through structure and distance, been close enough to it that moral responsibility could not be shrugged away. Both things were true. Lena despised stories that required such sentences. When she finally sat back, exhaustion crashed through the adrenaline. "How long?" she asked. Ethan understood the question without clarification. "If nothing breaks," he said, 10 days for wage protections, 2 weeks for housing transfer commitments, perhaps 3 for management removal without immediate plant closure." Lena looked at him with disbelief sharpened by fatigue. "You're asking me to sit on this for weeks. I'm asking you to consider whether publishing now protects the workers or satisfies the principle that immediate exposure is always the cleanest moral act. Truth should not have to wait for powerful people to manage consequences." "Agreed," Ethan said, "but vulnerable people sometimes do." The words settled between them like a weight. Lena left that meeting carrying more than documents. She carried a fracture inside the architecture of her certainty. For 2 days, she functioned outwardly as normal, attending editorial meetings, answering messages, refining timelines, speaking to sources, but internally, why she moved through argument after argument with no stable ground beneath them. Publish now and expose undeniable abuse. Hold the story and risk becoming the very kind of journalist she distrusted, one who let proximity to power soften urgency. Publish partially and management might still move before protections existed. Wait, and ND workers might suffer ongoing harm in the interim. She reviewed testimonies again. She imagined the first headlines. She imagined frightened workers called into offices before dawn. She imagined lawyers, denial, temporary staff cut loose, housing locks changed, public outrage flaring too late and too abstract to pay rent or buy medicine. She imagined Ethan's documents being true. She imagined them being strategically incomplete. Every path felt morally compromised. That more than anything tormented her. She had always journalism involved judgment, but usually the right shape of action revealed itself once enough evidence was gathered. Here evidence made the choice harder, not easier. Farid noticed her distraction on the second evening and closed the newsroom door behind them before speaking. "You have something," he said. Lena did not deny it. "Have something complicated." Farid sat on the edge of his desk and watched her with the seasoned caution of an editor who had seen conviction and self-deception wear similar expressions. Complicated how? Lena gave him the bones of the story without naming Ethan or handing over all the documents. She spoke in careful terms about labor abuse, corporate connections, and the possibility that immediate publication could trigger damage before safeguards were ready. Farid listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "And what do you think?" he asked. Lena let out a breath. "I think if I published tonight, I might be right in principle and wrong in consequence." Farid nodded once slowly. "That's the worst kind of story." "Yes." "And if you wait?" Lena looked down at her hands. "Then I'm trusting a process shaped by someone with power." Farid's expression did not soften, but something like respect entered it. "That part is obvious," he said. "The real question is whether you trust your own reading of the risk." She looked up. "Do you?" "I trust that you're the sort of person who gets sick when certainty turns dishonest," he replied. "That doesn't solve it, but it means you know the cost of whichever choice you make." That night Lena knocked for nearly an hour instead of going home directly. The city air had cooled, and storefront lights reflected in shallow rainwater along the pavement. She passed a family carrying groceries, a bus stop full of tired workers, two students laughing too loudly outside a pharmacy, and felt the ordinary weight of lives continuing whether or not people like her made the right decision in time. At some point, she ended up near the river where the water moved darkly beneath the bridges and the traffic noise thinned into something distant and almost gentle. She stood there with her hands in her coat pockets and let the arguments finish exhausting themselves. Beneath all of them lay a harder truth she had been resisting. This choice was not only about journalism. It was about trust. Not blind trust, not surrender, not sentimentality. Trust in her assessment that Ethan's effort was real, incomplete, morally compromised, and still possibly the best available route to protect the people at the center of the story. Trust that her restraint, if she chose it, would be discipline rather than weakness. Trust that she could delay publication without losing herself. The decision, when it finally came, felt nothing like relief. It felt like stepping onto uncertain ground and accepting that it might hold. The next morning, she sent Ethan a single message. "I'm holding the story for now, not because the abuse matters less, because the workers do. If the protections fail, I publish everything." His reply came several minutes later. "Understood. You have every right to." That was all. No gratitude, no triumph, no attempt to make the moment smaller than it was. Somehow that made it larger. They did not speak for 2 days after that. Lena thought perhaps distance was wise, perhaps necessary. She used the time to monitor developments through her own channels. One wage guarantee moved faster than expected. An external labor advisor appeared at the plant. Housing discussions began with a nonprofit intermediary she trusted independently. Temporary staff dismissals did not occur. It was not a resolution. It was motion. On the third evening, Ethan asked whether she could meet for coffee near the courthouse district. She almost refused on instinct, then heard the pettiness in that impulse and said yes. The cafe was nearly empty when she arrived, its windows fogged against the cool evening, and its radio playing old songs too softly to identify. Ethan stood when she approached the table, then sat again once she had taken the seat opposite him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was not hostile, careful, almost reverent, as if both understood that something between them had changed and neither wished to name it too quickly. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan said at last. Lena looked at her cup before answering. "Don't mistake what I did." Her voice was steady but quieter than usual. "I didn't protect you. I know. I'm still angry. I know that, too." She lifted her eyes to his. "Good. Something like a shadow of a smile touched his face and vanished. Then he grew serious again. "No one has trusted my judgment over their own principle in a very long time," he said. Lena held his gaze, surprised by the directness of the admission. "I haven't done that," she said, though the protest sounded thinner than she intended. Ethan shook his head slightly. "You stepped outside your rule. That matters." The word settled in her chest with unsettling warmth and weight. She looked away first, not out of submission, but because the honesty of the moment demanded somewhere for her eyes to rest. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than either of them expected. It was uncomfortable. Ethan gave a low, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Trust usually is." Lena looked back at him. "Don't get used to it." "I won't," he said, but there was something new in his expression now, not victory, not gratitude alone, but a kind of openness stripped of performance. For the first time since she had known him, he looked less like a man maintaining distance and more like one allowing himself briefly to stand without it. They talked for over an hour, not only about Kestrel or legal structures or wage protections, but about cost. The cost of acting too soon, the cost of waiting, the cost of being wrong in public and private. Lena admitted, with difficulty, that choosing not to publish had made her feel as though she had betrayed a younger version of herself who believed truth should always arrive like a blade. Ethan admitted, just as plainly, that being connected to Kestrel at all had forced him to confront the limits of quiet oversight and the dangerous comfort of believing good intentions could outrun structural blindness. Neither spared themselves. Neither offered absolution. Yet what passed between them in that small cafe under the dim yellow lights was something more durable than agreement. It was recognition. He saw how hard the choice had been for her. She saw how much it mattered that he understood that difficulty rather than consuming it as loyalty. When they finally stood to leave, the night outside had deepened and the street reflected scattered gold from the lamps. For a moment, they paused by the door, the city moving around them with its usual indifference. Lena pulled her coat more tightly around herself. Ethan looked as though he wanted to say something more, something personal and unscripted, but was not fully certain how to begin. In the end, he only said, "I'll keep you informed." Lena nodded once. "Do that." Then, after a beat, she added, "And Ethan," he waited. "Don't make me regret this." His answer came without hesitation. "I won't." She walked home with that promise echoing in her mind, not because promises from powerful men usually deserved belief, but because this one had been spoken without the self-protective flourish she had learned to distrust. Whether it would hold, she did not know. But as she crossed a quiet intersection and the wind lifted a strand of hair across her face, she became aware of something undeniable. In the space carved out by conflict, argument, disappointment, and moral risk, trust had begun. Not complete trust, not easy to trust, something smaller, rarer, and perhaps more real. The kind born not from admiration, but from seeing another person clearly at the edge of their own imperfection and choosing, despite fear, to believe they might still act with care. For Ethan, that trust arrived like something almost forgotten, unsettling in its tenderness. For Lena, it arrived like an injury she had willingly accepted because the alternative would have been worse. Neither of them would have called it intimacy. Neither would have rushed to define what had changed, yet both felt it quietly and unmistakably in the days that followed. Their conversations no longer carried only arguments. Beneath the disagreement ran a new current, steady and alive. And though neither said it aloud, both understood that the line between professional respect and something deeper had become far less certain than before. After Lena chose to hold the story, the world did not suddenly become easier. If anything, everything around her became sharper, heavier, and more difficult to ignore. Trusting Ethan's process did not free her from doubt. It only changed the shape of it. Every morning, she woke with the same uneasy awareness that real people were still living inside the consequences of delay. Workers were still reporting for shifts. Managers were still walking factory floors. Wages still needed protection, housing still needed separation from employer control, and every day that passed without public exposure carried both promise and danger. Yet something else had changed, too. For the first time in years, Lena was not acting alone against a wall of power. She was acting in tension with someone inside that world who did not dismiss her, did not flatter her, and did not ask her for blind patience. Ethan sent documents when he said he would. He updated her on the wage escrow arrangement, the transition plan for temporary housing, and the legal strategy to remove senior management without immediate plant closure. He did not soften the bad news. When one board member resisted the housing transfer and delayed signatures for 2 days, he told her directly. When a labor lawyer warned that media exposure at the wrong moment could still trigger panic among external clients, he sent the assessment without commentary, trusting her to evaluate it. That mattered more to Lena than she wanted to admit. He was not asking her to be loyal to him. He was asking her to remain loyal to the workers while seeing the full structure of risk. The distinction did not erase the tension between them, but it gave that tension a strange new stability, as though their arguments had laid a foundation neither had expected to use. They met often during those weeks, though rarely in ways that would have looked intimate to anyone watching from the outside. They met in offices after long days, in quiet cafes between site visits, in the back rows of community halls where people argued about funding and transport, and no one paid them much attention. They met beside loading bays while trucks were counted, in school courtyards after scholarship meetings, in clinic corridors where old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Yet somewhere between these practical encounters, something softer began to grow, something not announced, not claimed, but unmistakably present. It showed itself in small things first. Ethan began bringing Lena coffee without asking how she took it, because he had already noticed she drank it plain when she was tired and added sugar only on the worst days. Lena stopped pretending she did not recognize the look in his face when he was carrying too much responsibility at once and would quietly redirect the conversation before he withdrew into silence. When meetings ran late, they sometimes walked part of the same route back through the city, not because either of them needed company, but because neither seemed eager to end the conversation at the point where professional necessity expired. The city around them continued as it always had: traffic, rain, tired workers at bus stops, shop lights dimming into the evening. But for Lena, the atmosphere of those walks changed. She was used to moving through life with purpose like armor. Besides Ethan, purpose remained, but armor became harder to maintain. He asked questions that bypassed performance. He listened in a way that made careless answers feel dishonest, and slowly, against both of their instincts, honesty became easier than deflection. The first time Ethan spoke openly about his past was on a cold evening after they had spent most of the day at a school on the edge of the city where a scholarship fund had expanded faster than the building itself could manage. The classrooms were crowded, the roof leaked in one corner, and the principal looked permanently 2 minutes away from collapse, but the students were bright and disciplined, and the teachers had the exhausted patience of people who had learned how to do too much with too little. Lena had come to observe the meeting partly for her own reporting and partly because the Kestrel situation was finally moving into a more stable phase. Several key protections were in place. The board restructuring had begun. The air around the crisis felt less combustible, though not yet safe enough to stop watching. After the school visit, the rain started suddenly, hard enough to turn the road outside into silver lines. The principal insisted they wait in a small office until the worst of it passed. The room smelled faintly of damp paper and old wood. A fan turned slowly overhead, clicking with each rotation. They sat opposite each other at a desk too small for both of them, sharing the kind of tired quiet that follows a day spent trying to solve problems no one person can solve completely. For a long time neither spoke. Rain hammered the windows. Somewhere down the corridor or a child laughed, then was hushed by a teacher. Lena was reviewing notes in her head when Ethan said without preamble, I wasn't always good at this. She looked up, unsure at first what he meant. At what? She asked. Ethan rested his elbows lightly on his knees and looked not at her but at the rain. At strategy, Lena said nothing. Instinct told her the moment was delicate, and unlike the early weeks between them, she no longer felt the urge to press every opening simply because it existed. Ethan seemed to sense that quiet and trusted it. Years ago, he continued, before any of this became what it is now, I was involved in projects that were larger on paper than in reality. Expensive, visible, admired for all the right reasons. Good intentions everywhere, statements, launches, speeches, people calling it impact before anyone had measured a single thing. His voice remained even, but there was a weight in it Lena had never heard so clearly before. And I believed some of it, enough to think the movement itself meant progress. He paused, then let out a low breath. Someone I loved. Didn't. Lena's fingers tightened slightly around her notebook, though she did not look down at it. Ethan had never used language like that before. Not someone close to me, not a loss in the abstract, someone I loved. He still wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the rain-streaked glass, as if memory had made the room smaller. She worked in public health, he said, brilliant, impatient, difficult in the best ways. She could walk into a room full of polished people and within 5 minutes identify who understood the actual problem and who only understood how to speak about it. A faint, sad trace of a smile touched his mouth and disappeared. She used to tell me that I was too willing to confuse movement with meaning, that building something impressive was not the same as building something that lasted. Lena listened without interruption. She could hear the care with which he was choosing each word, not to dramatize, but to avoid simplifying what still hurt. There was an outbreak in a rural district, he went on, nothing that would matter to people in capital cities unless it spread. A clinic had been underfunded for years, supplies were delayed. The response infrastructure looked stronger on reports than it was in practice. Had the connections to help faster, but everything got trapped inside meetings, approval chains, public coordination, all the machinery that allows important people to feel responsible while time is being wasted. His jaw tightened slightly. She went there anyway. The rain seemed louder then, or perhaps the silence between them had become more precise. Lena knew better than to ask what happened next. Ethan continued because he had chosen to, not because she extracted it. She became ill there, he said. It was preventable, not in the simplistic way people say that after the fact, but preventable enough. He finally looked at Lena then, and what she saw in his eyes was not the rawness of recent grief, but the deeper ache of something long carried without being put down. After that, I lost all patience for systems that cared more about appearing coordinated than acting in time. I also lost patience for attention. Public grief is its own economy. People bring admiration, sympathy, and interpretation. They tell you who the dead was supposed to mean. They turn the worst thing that happened to you into a language everyone else can use. He gave a small, humorless shake of his head. I stopped wanting any of it. I stopped believing that visible goodness was inherently good. Quiet action became easier. Distance became easier. And eventually distance became habit. Lena felt something in her chest shift painfully at the clarity of it. She had suspected some past loss shaped him, but suspicion and hearing it in his own voice were very different things. This was not a polished origin story. It was not a carefully useful wound. It was simply the truth offered without decoration because somehow he had decided she could be trusted to hold it. When Lena finally spoke, her voice was softer than she intended. You kept helping. Ethan's expression barely changed, but there was the slightest flicker of surprise in it, as if he had expected a more analytical response. I didn't know what else to do, he said. Stopping would have made the loss feel smaller somehow, and I couldn't bear that. So, I kept building, but differently. Less noise, more structure, more questions before declarations. Lena looked at him steadily. And less closeness. He did not deny it. Yes, he said. Less of that, too. For a moment, neither moved. The rain had slowed now, becoming gentler, almost thoughtful. Lena realized that what moved her most was not only the sadness of his story, but the discipline it had created in him. He had not become cold because he felt nothing. He had become careful because feeling too much once had rearranged the entire architecture of his life. It was that realization, more than anything, that loosened something in her own silence. Lena was not a woman who offered personal history easily. She had spent years making herself useful through clarity, not confession. In her world, vulnerability was often exploited, softened into narrative, or mistaken for invitation. But Ethan had just given her something that was not meant for public use, and she knew instinctively that leaving the room with only his honesty between them would create a false imbalance neither of them wanted. She set her notebook aside and leaned back in the hard office chair. When I was a child, she said slowly, I used to think the worst thing in the world was being invisible. He said nothing, but his attention sharpened. Not physically, Lena continued. I mean the kind of invisible that happens when people decide your life is too ordinary to matter. My mother worked constantly. My father had strong opinions and very little power, which is a dangerous combination in a small apartment. There was always money stress, always some official office telling us to wait, always some polite person explaining why a decision had been made somewhere else by someone unavailable. She gave a quiet breath that was almost a laugh, but held no humor. I learned early that systems speak very well about fairness, while ordinary people disappear inside their delays. Ethan listened with the same steady focus he gave to workers, principals, nurses, and lawyers. Not performative concern, not pity. Attention. At school, Lena said, I was good enough to be useful and quiet enough to be ignored. Teachers liked me because I worked hard and did not cause problems. That's a lovely way to vanish. People only notice the loud forms of pain. They rarely notice children who become competent too early because they realize no one is coming to explain the world gently. She paused, surprised by how plainly the words were coming now. Later, when I became a journalist, I think I was still chasing the same thing. No tension for myself, witness, proof that what happens to ordinary people is real even when no one important feels interrupted by it. Every story became a refusal to let someone else decide what could remain unseen. Ethan's gaze did not leave her face. That's why you push so hard, he said, not as a question but as recognition. Lena nodded once. Yes. And maybe because if I ever stop, I'm afraid I'll become the kind of person who accepts polite injustice as normal. The honesty of that admission left the air between them changed. Ethan did not rush to reassure her. He did not tell her she was more than her anger. He simply absorbed what she had said and allowed it to stand with dignity. You were never invisible to yourself, he said after a moment. Lena looked at him startled. It was such a careful sentence, simple but careful. I'm not sure that helped, she replied. It made you dangerous, he said. And this time his mouth softened into the faintest real smile. Against her better judgment, Lena smiled back. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. Inside that cramped office with the clicking fan and the smell of damp paper, they were no longer arguing from opposite principles. They were speaking as two people shaped by different forms of pain that had taught them opposite reflexes. Her toward exposure, him toward protection. And yet beneath those differences lay the same original refusal. Neither of them could bear indifference dressed as reason. After that evening, their bond deepened in ways neither tried to name. It was still not romance in the easy sense. No declarations, no dramatic gestures, no sudden collapse of all caution. Instead, it was something slower and for both of them far more unsettling, mutual understanding. Once you understand the wound beneath a person's habits, you can no longer respond to those habits as if they appeared from nowhere. Lena no longer saw Ethan's distance as arrogance or control. She saw the structure of grief inside it. Ethan no longer saw Lena's relentless pressure as merely professional aggression. He saw the child who had learned too early that silence could erase entire lives. This understanding did not make disagreement disappear. If anything, it made their disagreements more honest because each now knew the other's convictions were not intellectual poses. When Lena challenged him, he no longer mistook it for hostility. When Ethan urged caution, she no longer heard only the voice of privilege defending itself. They had become more dangerous to one another precisely because they could now wound where it mattered. And yet this new knowledge also made them gentler. It created the first true trust either had allowed in a long time. Even Ryan Vass, far from the center of their lives and yet linked to it by that strange first meeting on the plane, began to change in his own small, uneven way. Lena learned this first through Ethan, who mentioned it almost casually during a drive back from the industrial district. Ryan asked whether he could volunteer at one of the youth centers. Ethan said, "Eyes on the road." Lena turned to look at him. "The same Ryan. There is thankfully only one." She let out an unexpected laugh. "And you said yes?" Ethan nodded. "With conditions." "Which were?" "No publicity, no performance. He arrives on time, does the work he's given, and understands that an apology is not a single moment." Lena leaned back in her seat imagining the entitled teenager from the plane carrying boxes or cleaning tables under the supervision of people unimpressed by his surname. Did his father approve? Ethan's expression turned dry. Daniel Vass is still not entirely sure whether he's being punished or educated. Over the next few weeks, Ryan appeared quietly at 2 community programs funded through one of Ethan's networks. At first, he was awkward, impatient, and visibly uncomfortable around tasks that did not reward status. But children had a way of ignoring social hierarchies that adults worshipped, and under that pressure, something in him slowly shifted. He was corrected. He was useful. He learned that respect was not the same as fear, and that no one cared what school he attended when chairs needed to be stacked or supplies carried. Lena met him once at a neighborhood center and barely recognized the guarded humility in his voice. He was still young, still unfinished, still capable of arrogance, but a small real change had begun. She found that oddly moving, perhaps because it reminded her that people did not always have to be trapped forever inside their worst moment. For a brief period, it seemed possible that the hardest part of the Kestrel crisis might end quietly. The wage protections were activated. Temporary housing was transferred to an independent management structure. Several abusive managers were removed under the board reshuffle. External legal review expanded. Workers who had feared immediate dismissal kept their jobs. It was not justice in any pure sense, but it was a movement toward safety, and in lives like those Lena had documented, safety mattered more urgently than moral clarity. She began cautiously to think she had made the right choice. She was already outlining how she would eventually tell the story, not as a simple scandal, not as a redemption arc for Ethan, but as a hard examination of private power, labor abuse, delayed truth, and the ethics of consequence. She wanted the piece to be as rigorous as the situation deserved. She wanted workers centered, not used. She wanted Ethan to be implicated where he should be implicated and recognized where recognition was due. It would be the most difficult story she had ever written, and for once, difficulty did not
discourage her. It sharpened her. Then, the leak happened. It broke on a Wednesday morning before sunrise, the way modern disasters often do, through a half-verified digital report posted by a media site more interested in speed than structure. The first headline reduced everything to a scandal. Secret investment ties link reclusive philanthropist to abusive labor plant. Within an hour, other outlets repeated it. Some embellished. Some guessed. Some dug up old photos of Ethan, attached language about hypocrisy, and framed the story as proof that every quiet benefactor was simply hiding rot behind humility. None of the early coverage included the worker protections already underway. None mentioned the housing transfers, the legal interventions, the board pressure, or the fact that public exposure at this exact stage had been the outcome everyone most hoped to manage carefully. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Ethan's name was everywhere. Commentators who had never heard of Kestrel the week before were debating his character with the confidence of people unburdened by facts. Photos from past events reappeared. Anonymous sources suddenly multiplied. Threads, clips, accusations, triumphantly cynical hot takes. The media storm hit not like a clean truth, but like a wave of distortion carrying enough reality to feel righteous, and enough simplification to harm. Lena was awake within minutes of the first alert on her phone. By the time she reached her kitchen, messages were already arriving from Farid, from labor contacts, from 2 editors at other outlets fishing for comment, from one source at Kestrel who simply wrote, "They know." Her stomach dropped. She moved fast, laptop open, notes spread, calls placed. The immediate damage was exactly what she had feared. Clients were pausing contracts. Workers were panicking about whether the plant would survive. Management, sensing collapse, was suddenly denying everything more aggressively. And Ethan, dragged into the center of the storm, was now facing the very kind of public spectacle he had spent years avoiding. Yet Lena's first emotion was not vindication. It was fury. Fury at the leak, at the laziness of the coverage, at herself for feeling the bitter thought "I was right, and I was right too late." She knew instantly that silence would now be its own form of harm. The story was out. The question was who would shape its meaning. Farid called first. "Tell me you were holding something because the workers needed protection and not because you lost your mind," he said without greeting. Lena closed her eyes briefly. "I was holding it because the workers needed protection." There was a pause, then more quietly, "Can you prove that?" Lena looked at the folders across her table. "Yes." Farid exhaled. "Then decide fast. By now every outlet in the city will have turned this into either hypocrisy theater or billionaire persecution nonsense. If there's a real story underneath, this is the moment to tell it." After he hung up, Lena stood still for several seconds, phone in hand. She knew what the easy option was: protect herself, say nothing, let other reporters take the heat for bad coverage while she maintained private correctness and told herself complexity had no audience in moments like this. It would be safer professionally. It would spare her accusations of collusion, partiality, conflict, and proximity. It would also abandon the truth she had worked so hard to protect. Not only the truth
of the abuse, but the truth of the attempted repair, the timing, the responsibility, the moral cost carried by everyone involved. Ethan had been implicated. He should be, but he had also acted to prevent further damage before exposure. The workers were not symbols in a purity contest. They were people still vulnerable to whatever narrative won the day. Lena looked out her window at the city in full morning motion and felt the decision settle with terrible clarity. She could not stay silent. Ethan did not call. That more than anything clarified the choice for her. He did not ask for a defense. He did not ask for help. He did not use their trust to claim protection in public. Perhaps he was too overwhelmed, perhaps too disciplined, perhaps simply unwilling to let her risk herself on his behalf. But the absence of any request made the moral line cleaner. If she spoke now, she would be speaking because she believed the full truth mattered, not because he had drawn her into his orbit. She opened her laptop, began assembling her notes, and wrote faster than she ever had before. Not a reaction piece, not a defense, a full account. She laid out the labor abuses with evidence. She detailed the investment link and Ethan's undeniable proximity to a system that had allowed harm. Then she added what no one else had, the internal intervention already underway before the leak, the wage escrow measures, the housing separation, the board restructuring, the reason immediate exposure had threatened to injure the workers first. She wrote about the unbearable tension between journalistic principle and material consequence. She wrote that powerful people must be scrutinized not only for the damage they permit, but also for the choices they make when they discover it. She named her own decision to delay publication and accepted the risk of being judged for it. Every paragraph cost her something. Every sentence had to be precise enough to survive an attack from all sides, but once she began, she knew she was writing not just an article, but a claim about what truth actually required when reality refused simplicity. The piece went live shortly after noon. The backlash started within minutes. Some accused her of becoming too close to her subject. Some accused her of laundering Ethan's reputation through elegant nuance. Others attacked her for admitting she had delayed publication at all, but just as quickly, workers and labor organizers began sharing the parts that mattered to them. Lawyers confirmed the escrow timeline. Independent housing advocates verified the transfer process. 2 public health administrators spoke on record about Ethan's pattern of quiet crisis intervention in other contexts without excusing the Kestrel link. Farid called once only to say, "You've made everyone angry." That usually means the story is real. Lena did not laugh. She was too tired, too aware that real people were still living inside the story while the public argument turned it into a morality play. By evening, Ethan's office issued a statement far more direct than anyone expected. He acknowledged the investment connection, acknowledged that the abuse should have been seen sooner, acknowledged responsibility without evasion, and committed publicly to worker protection funds and external oversight. It was not enough to satisfy everyone, nor should it have been, but it was honest in a way most crisis statements were not. Lena read it twice and understood immediately that her article had changed the terms on which he could respond. She
had not saved him. She had made it impossible for him to hide inside either silence or shallow public repentance. She had given the full truth room to breathe. What he did with that room was now his choice. They did not speak until late that night. Ethan sent only a brief message asking whether she was still at the office. She was. The newsroom had emptied to a dull hum and scattered pools of light. Rain tapped softly against the windows. When Ethan arrived, he looked as though the day had stripped him down to essentials. No coat despite the weather, no assistance, no practiced composure beyond what habit forced. Lena stood when he stepped into the doorway of the conference room and for a second neither moved. The long jihad day stood between them, dense with everything neither could summarize quickly. Ethan crossed the room first. "You didn't have to do that," he said, the same words he had spoken once before, but heavier now, almost rough with feeling he was not used to voicing. Lena gave a tired breath. "Apparently, Lee, I keep doing things I don't have to do." That earned the faintest shadow of a smile, but it vanished quickly. He looked at her with a steadiness that felt almost unguarded. "You could have stayed silent," he said. "Yes, it would have been safer." "Yes." Ethan's throat moved slightly as if he were forcing something past restraint. "But you didn't." Lena held his gaze. "Because silence would have made the story smaller than the truth." For a moment, the room seemed to narrow around them, all the noise of the city and the day falling away. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was quieter. "For the first time in a very long time, someone stood beside me without fear, without gain, and without asking me to be less responsible than I am." Lena felt the words land somewhere deep and unsteady. She looked down briefly, then back up.
"Don't make it sound noble," she said softly. "It was awful. That time he did smile, a real one, tired and brief and painfully human. I'm sure it was." He stepped closer, not enough to presume, only enough to let honesty remain between them without distance blurring it. "You changed how I see things," he said. There was nothing polished in the sentence, no metaphor, no strategic ambiguity. Just the truth. Lena felt her own defenses shift in response to its simplicity. A small involuntary smile touched her mouth. "You did the same," she answered. It was the closest either of them had come to saying aloud what had been growing between them for weeks. Not love, not yet, but change. Real change. The kind that happens when another person reaches the part of you long governed by old certainty and leaves it unable to return unchanged. In the days that followed, the storm slowly became something more useful than outrage. Because the full truth was now in public, the response had less room for cheap simplification. Worker protections held. External oversight hardened into policy rather than a promise. Housing remained independent. The worst managers did not return. The plant survived under a new operating structure. Damage had been done and some reputations would never recover, but the people most vulnerable to immediate collapse were not abandoned. That mattered. Lena kept reporting carefully, refusing both the temptation to sanctify Ethan and the temptation to punish him beyond what facts justified. Ethan, for his part, became more publicly present than he had been in years. Not transformed into a spotlight seeker, but no longer hiding behind complete absence. He attended one labor review hearing in person. He answered difficult questions directly. He allowed his name to remain attached to certain corrective measures instead of disappearing once the worst was over. The change was subtle, but for someone like him, it was enormous. Meanwhile, Lena found that her own relationship to truth had shifted, too. Not weakened, not softened into compromise, deepened. She still believed exposure was necessary. She still believed systems thrived on silence. But she now understood in her bones that timing and consequence were not excuses merely because powerful people often use them as such. Sometimes they were the difference between a story that exposed harm and a story that multiplied it. That knowledge made her more careful and therefore more formidable. Their final meeting after the storm was quiet enough that another person might have missed its significance entirely. No crisis, no urgent documents, no cameras. They met in a small cafe near the airport by accident at first and then by mutual choice months after the flight that had begun everything. Outside, planes moved across the darkening sky in slow, bright lines. Inside, the cafe was warm and almost empty, its windows reflecting light at them like another softer room. Ethan arrived first this time and was already seated when Lena walked in. He wore the same kind of simple dark jacket he had worn on the plane, and for one fleeting second the memory of that first encounter rose so clearly that she almost smiled before reaching the table. There had been judgment then and silence and humiliation and a strange immediate curiosity neither of them understood. Now there was none of that, no tension waiting to prove itself, no roles to defend. Only the ease, still new and still precious, of two people who had already seen each other at their most difficult edges and remained. They talked about ordinary things at first, the youth center Ryan still visited on weekends, the clinic roof finally repaired, a teacher from the scholarship school who had taken a better paying post and deserved it. The ordinariness of the conversation itself felt intimate, not because of what was said but because neither needed the protection of constant seriousness in him. At one point Lena looked at him across the table and realized how different his stillness felt now. On the plain knee, it had seemed like a distance. Then it had become a mystery, then caution. Now it felt like a presence, not always easy, not fully surrendered, but present. Ethan seemed to notice her studying him and tilted his head slightly. "What?" he asked. Lena shook her head once. "Nothing." He gave her a look that made it clear he did not believe that answer. "That sounds unlikely." She smiled, this time without resistance. "I was just thinking how strange it is that we started with a spoiled teenager insulting you on a flight." Ethan's expression softened. "I remember thinking you were going to turn the entire cabin into a courtroom. I considered it." "I'm glad you didn't." Why? He looked at her for a moment before replying, because then I.
Stay polite, they reacted. A look, a sigh, something. But this man gave him nothing. That only made Ryan more interested. Across the aisle, Lena Hassan observed everything. She had been reading before, her attention on a document displayed on her tablet, but Ryan's voice had pulled her out of it immediately. She didn't need to look up right away to understand what was happening. She had heard enough situations like this to recognize the pattern instantly. Still, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes moved first to Ryan, taking in his posture, his expression, the careless confidence that seemed almost rehearsed. Then she looked at the man beside him. And that was when something about the scene didn't quite sit right with her. The man didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't even look annoyed. He looked peaceful, as if Ryan's words were nothing more than background noise. Lena narrowed her eyes slightly. That was unusual. Ryan leaned back again, letting out another short laugh. You know, he continued louder this time, some people just don't belong in places like this. That was when Lena decided to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry, but there was a firmness in her tone that carried its own weight. You don't measure someone's worth by what they wear. The words landed cleanly in the space between them. Ryan turned his head, clearly not expecting to be interrupted. His eyes scanned Lena, taking in her composed posture, her steady gaze, the quiet confidence that matched his own but in a very different way. He rolled his